Grand Rising, Grand Rising, Grand Rising, YT Kubuli, what's going on? Wago on. This is your brother, Chief Kalinago, with another lesson. Hope everybody's doing well, and I'm still out here in Dominica. It's beautiful. The sun is out. I already drank 2 coconuts. I already ate some kennips. I had some soursop, and I'm living life. Life is beautiful here in the Garden of Eden because that's what YT Kubuli is, Miss Norma Dominica. We are living in the Garden of Eden. And once again, my videos are strictly for giving out and teaching knowledge, okay, from a different perspective, not from historical or his perspective, but from different prehistoric books and different authors. The truth of the matter is the truth is actually out there, but we have to read many, many, many books and many other sources apart from what we are being taught in the conventional educational system in order to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, they will give you some truth, but the majority of it is literally it is diluted and it's filled with false information or not. The information is not complete. So therefore, reading different books and putting the pieces together and asking for guidance from your ancestors, they will guide you to the truth. And that's what I've done. So with that being said, we're about to do a little bit of reading. We are being told, and once again, please allow me to reiterate, I have nothing against the continent of Africa. I have nothing against the people of Africa. But however, the American continent is my motherland. Okay. And so it is the motherland of many of us, okay, out here in the Americas. Over 90% of us in the Americas, America is our motherland. It also in YT Kubuli, this is our motherland. We were not sent from Africa here on slave ships. That's a lie. Okay, they lied to us. You feel me? So you have to study to find that information out. So in this book, I'm going to read, okay, and like I always tell people, whenever I don't eat meat, but I'm going to use this analogy. Whenever you eat meat, sometimes you have to eat the meat and separate the meat from the bone in order to get to the good parts. All right. And that's what I do with a lot of these books, because every book is given different information. And then when you pull a piece from here, a piece from there, a piece from over here, then you're able to, again, create a complete picture. And then that's when it will start all making sense. So without further ado, let's get into this book. Reading is fun for the mental. We got to study to show ourselves approved. All right. Let me go ahead and make sure I have audio here on YouTube. Give me 1 second, please. I know I got some audio somewhere. Hold on. Wait a minute. Hold on. Give me 1 second, please. I know I got some audio somewhere. Yeah. All right. Cool. Yeah, we got audio on YouTube. So we good. We good. Let's get into this and let's do some reading. As always, I have given you the link for this book that I'm reading from, so you will always be able to do your own reading and get the information for yourself. This book is Civilization. What is it called again? Give me 1 second. It is called Civilization and the Ancient Egyptians. All right. Now, here, like I've mentioned before, the concept of Egypt, the original concept of Egypt, like I showed y'all in one of the lessons, was actually in the Americas. Okay. And then the people in the Americas, they went down the Mississippi into the Nile because they were connected. All right. Or they're still connected. They're just not telling us the truth. All right. And because of encroaching invaders, they took that civilization into Africa and Kemet was born. All right. That's why the oldest pyramids are in the Americas. The most pyramids are in the Americas, and the most sophisticated pyramids are in the Americas. The pyramids were used for solar lights and communicating, with our ancestors. Okay, these things are real. The truth of the matter is, you think we have technology now? No, our ancestors had greater technology and more sophisticated technology. As a matter of fact, we have been dumbed down. And we are going to continue to be dumbed down unless we choose to awaken ourselves from this coma that they have put us in. So with that being said, let's do some reading without further ado. I know I've said this before, but I like to give a little more explanation, when it comes to the foundation of things. Okay. And this book is by Katanga A. Bongo. All right. So let's read. What does it say here? Table of contents. And we're going to pass that and we're going to go to the first chapter or the first portion of the book, introduction. In fact, we're going to read the introduction. All right. Here we are. Introduction of the book. So we're going to talk about the continent called Africa. The continent called Africa. Okay. Let me just see if I can slide this to the side and kind of center that. Yes, here we go. The continent called Africa. The continent that today is known as Africa has, in the last 200 years, been a land of great deal of fascination to the Western world. A lot has been written and said about this continent. Unfortunately, almost all that has been written and said about Africa has been negative, and most of it simply untrue. This negative notion of Africa reflects the little knowledge that Westerners have about the history of the continent and its people. Westerners have labeled this continent the dark continent. This labeling has led most people outside and inside Africa to think of Africa as a land in which there has no civilization prior to the arrival of Europeans. Now, when we talk about Europeans, we could look at Europeans from two different perspectives or two different set of lenses. One, if we're talking about the original Europeans are people of color. Okay. And if we're talking about the latecomers, then we're talking about the pale people. All right. So either way, it doesn't make a difference because either way, what was written about Africa, whether it was by, the people of color from Europe or the newcomers, the pale people, then a lot of untruth were written about Africa, and that's what we are talking about here. All right. Almost all his history books written about Africa or any part of Africa have tended to focus on the interaction between Africans and Europeans. All right. Hold on for 1 second, please. Man, these mosquitoes and these sandflies, they're eating me alive. One would be hard pressed to find a history book that addressed the history of this continent prior to the arrival of Europeans in Africa in the 16th and the 17th century. Okay, centuries. So if they're talking about the 17th centuries, then here they're talking about the pale people, because the pale people, started going into Africa. Then the pale people only became a prominent force in the Americas not until the late 1800s. Okay, not until the 1800s, late 1800s. And that's why I had to go show you the proof that all the people of nobility, the kings, the queens of Europe, they were people of color until Queen Victoria. And even Queen Victoria, she was also mixed, but she was more on the pale side. Okay, she was more on the pale side. Let's continue. This vacuum of knowledge about Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans in Africa is the result of two factors. First, there's very little written account of life in Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans. The only written account of early African history, comes to us from 11th and 12th century Arab writers. Now, if you don't know what Arabs are a mix of people. Most of them are colored people, but they are of the what I would call a mixture of the seven and the eighth ether. Okay, in terms of the hair texture. Okay, they are not original people, but they're still hue, which means color. All right, these Arab writers were well known Muslim scholars written in Arabic. The most notables of these Arab writers were al-Bukhari and al-Idrisi. Their writings mostly describe the African peoples living in the Western Sudan. However, most of their written accounts were based on accounts from Arab merchants and were often inaccurate. Second, modern African historians were trained by European educators, either in Europe or in Africa. All right. So when you hear all these people that's giving you all this history and the theory of life originated in Africa and the slave trade, those are modern historians writing these fabricated stories. They are absolutely not true. And it was done for a reason. And this is what this channel is about. It's about bringing the knowledge and teaching you the truth so you're able to free yourself, okay, mentally, physically. These African historians tend to have the mentality that was infused in them by their European teachers, just like the schools out here in Dominica and different parts of the Americas. Okay, these teachers are teaching what they were taught to teach to be the truth. Okay, and a lot of times when you bring anything outside of the ideologies of the school system, people look at you like you're crazy. Oh, well, you can't tell me anything. I got my master's. Well, what do you have your master's in? Who gave you the masters? The colonizers. And once again, like I tell people, I have nothing against people that claim to be educated. But education is from a standpoint, from a colonial perspective. In other words, it's a programming. All right. But knowledge and wisdom is a whole complete different ballgame. Okay. Very little has been done to reconstruct African history prior to the arrival of Europeans. The result is that there is several distorted view of African history that has led people outside and inside Africa to believe that it was Europeans who introduced civilizations to Africa. Okay? But admittedly, piecing together the history of a people as diverse as the Africans present enormous challenge. Some historians have noted that the destruction of African culture due to assaults by Europeans and Europeanized Africans makes the rewriting of African history a challenging task indeed. What makes the rewriting of history especially difficult, though, is the fact that when European diseases, particularly measles, first arrived in the continent in the 17th and the 18th centuries, most of the Africans abandoned their empires and fled into the primitive forest. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. All right, keep that in mind. When measles and what it says, when the measles, okay, well, European diseases, because remember, Europe was going through a few centuries of plagues, even a famine and drought. Okay, but when these plagues got into Africa from the Europeans, then particularly measles, the Africans fled, their rural areas, okay, and then they fled into the primitive forest. Now, it did not say they died. It did not say they became extinct. It did not say that these measles killed the Africans. Now, I want you to keep that in mind because this is very important. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And that's why I tell people, when you read, you have to read with discernment. Okay, you have to be able to read with conductive reasoning. In other words, you have to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. You have to study those things and know how to make sense out of nonsense. So clearly we are seeing that these Europeans, be it colored Europeans or be it pale Europeans, the bottom line is they went into Africa and they brought measles, but the people did not die. They fled into the primitive forest. Okay? Life in the forest was extremely challenging and the Africans had to adapt. So we are talking about Africans who were not used to living in the forest. Those people were living in rural areas. Okay? Mostly flat land, trees are cut, et cetera, et cetera. But they were not a forest life people like we were in the Americas. Okay, but yet still had civilization. Cultures were lost as the Africans were forced to evolve new cultures in order to survive the forest. This new cultural evolution, dictated by the challenges in the forest, led to the vast cultural diversity that we see today. So the reason why Africa is so diverse is because of this reason. All right. However, certain fundamental cultural traits related to languages, religion, agriculture, and architecture, remained intact in these new African cultures. Because of that, it is still possible to piece together common cultural traits. And by linking these elements, one should be able to identify the source of civilization in Africa and the approximate time that it started. Once the source of civilization is identified, the history of the African people can be reconstructed. The idea that it was Europeans who brought civilization or introduced civilization to Africa is one of the biggest historical myths. Once again, we are seeing that all these myths, okay, and fabrications and fairy tales, they are coming from his historical perspective. In other words, he was telling that story so he could make himself great. Okay, and people don't realize that because they don't read outside of what I call the uniformed school system. In other words, we're going to put you in a box, a school, a classroom. We're going to put you in a uniform and we're going to teach you and we're going to program your mind and we're going to indoctrinate you to think a certain way, learn certain information so that we could indoctrinate you. Okay? Now, let's read this again. The idea that it was Europeans who introduced civilization to Africa or is one of the biggest historical myths. Just like life originated in Africa, okay, or human beings. You have to realize there's a difference between man and mankind. Mankind are humans, Human. And man, the original man, is human, Hueman. You see, but like I said, you cannot explain all these things to everybody because not everybody's going to get it. Many of you will listen and see the facts and still think I'm crazy. But trust, I know what I'm talking about. Let's continue reading. All right. Let's continue. All right. In fact, evidence from now here's where the evidence is coming from. Okay. This is not he say or she say. We are talking about archaeological evidence. So let's read. In fact, evidence from archaeology, oral history, traditional languages, and cultural practices strongly indicate that it was the South American Indians who introduced civilization to Africa some 7,000 years ago. You feel me? But his story, the pale man will teach you no. It was Africans who came here and gave the Americans, especially in South America and the Caribbean, it was their culture. No. The cultures are similar because we gave it to them. So when you have stuff like ballet in YT Kubuli, our local dances, our traditional dances, no, it did not come from Africa. We gave it to Africa. Okay, we gave it to Africa. And many of you, like I said, will see this and learn this to be true, but because they give you such emotional attachment to Africa, you will not see it and still want to call yourself African because you have lost your roots. So now you're attaching yourself to the branches. Africa is the branches. It is not the root. But this is not my roots. I could speak for myself. But I guarantee you, over 90% of the people in Dominica, YT Kubuli, their ancestors did not come from Africa. Okay, let's read this again. In fact, evidence from archaeology. Okay, in other words, they dug the ground, they dug the earth, they took rocks, they took different, stuff from nature. And this is what it was concluded. Then oral history. Do you know what oral history is? That these Africans, the elders who know the truth, they know the truth because that's what was passed on. But the schools they won't teach you this. What's more important than oral history? Than your great grandmother telling you, hey, this is what the truth is? Or the school system telling you what the truth is? So it's oral history. Even in the traditional languages and the cultural practices, okay? Like I said, a lot of the culture we have in YT Kubuli, it did not come from Africa. But our people could swear and die to their grave that their ancestors came from Africa because they were told a lie. Okay? But it strongly indicates that it was South American Indians who introduced civilization into Africa some 7,000 years ago. Now, do you know how convoluted information could be after 7,000 years? I want you to do a test, an experiment. Okay? I would like you to take about 30 people, and I want you to create a story and tell it to the first individual, just 30 people. Tell it to the first individual. I guarantee you, by the time you get to the 30th individual, the story would have changed. And that's within an hour. If it took you an hour to get to the 30th individual, can you imagine 7,000 years? Hmm? When you have a new race, the pale race stepping up to get notoriety, right? They want to make a place for themselves. So they have to create a story. Okay? They have to create a story. And that's what it was. Because if I could tell you the entire Americas was empty, nobody was there, and we discovered it, guess who it belongs to? The people who discovered it. But they even lied about who discovered it, if it was discovered at all, because it wasn't. Because the people who came in 1492 were people of color. Okay? But the pale children are the children of those so-called Black Asiatics and these so-called Black Europeans. All right? Man, listen, it is just so much truth people have to learn. It's not even funny. Let's continue. Spurred on by their American Indian guest, okay? Because our ancestors went to Africa to give them civilization. As a matter of fact, about 7,000 years ago, 67,000 years ago, about 10,000 American Indians went into Nigeria and gave them civilization, but they will not teach you that. But let us read that again. Spurred on by their American Indian guests, the Africans built great empires that lasted for several thousand years at a time. Contrary to popular myth in the Western world, the advent of Europeans destroyed civilization in Africa rather than made it. Because after we gave it to Africa, they destroyed it and they rebuilt. And what they are talking about is the rebuilding of Africa, and they are accredited for that. But they will tell you, no, they're the ones who brought civilization. No, it was our American Indian ancestors. Okay, be it the Olmecs, be it the Mayans, the Aztecs, the people we call Caribs or the Arawaks. Either way, we brought civilization. And when I talk about the so-called Caribs and the Arawaks and the Taínos, those people were people of color. They look like you and I. All right. These people, like I told you, they have in these reserves. All right. They are not the original people. Even in the United States, the Native Americans, they are not the original people. But like I said, this is just the beginning. I'm here to open up your mind. The last 400 years have been a nightmare for the African people, considering the kinds of civilization that the early Africans enjoyed in the 6,000 years or so years prior to that. There is an abundance of cultural and technological evidence in South America and Africa that strongly suggests that there was a long interaction between the Africans and the South American Indians. Yes, because we gave them civilization. We taught them our culture. People think voodoo came from Africa. No, it came from the Americas. And voodoo is not a bad thing. It's what you do with it. Okay? It's what you do with it. You could use it for good. You could use it for bad, like everything else. They tell you, oh, well, the love of money is the root of all evil. Is it really? Or it's what you use the money that is the root of evil, not the love of a piece of paper. I could love a piece of paper. How is that evil? I could love a piece of metal, money, coin. How is that evil? It's what I take it to do. Because if the love of money was that evil, then all these religious people wouldn't want to be rich. But you see, they got people thinking this thing so these people could stay poor spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, so they could break down. Because the people who are so-called in power, they are vampires, sucking your blood and sucking your energy. All right, so they have to lie to you to keep you dumbfounded, to keep you in a coma. But let us continue to read, because like I said, our ancestors had a long lasting relationship with Africans. All right, but we are a distinct people. We are not Africans. Let us proceed. However, Western anthropologists and historians have traditionally not been interested in this evidence. You see, there's evidence to show and prove, but they're not interested in that because they don't want you to know that the so-called Negroes that's in the Americas, the so-called Black people that's in America, they don't want you to know that we are the American Aboriginals. They don't want you to know we have always been here and we did not come to Africa. We did not come from Africa, pardon me. So they had to come up with a story about slaves and a slave trade and 12 million people coming into the Americas as so-called black slaves. That's a lie. And I'm going to break all of that down to y'all. Okay? I'm going to break all of this down. It's time to rethink and retrain your mind, reprogram your mind to free yourself. They're not interested in the evidence. African historians appear not to be aware of the long interaction that took place between the South American Indians and the Africans starting about 7,000 years ago. This interaction ended when the South American Indians died out suddenly in the 16th centuries now and the 17th centuries. Now, this is where you have to start picking the meat from the bone. So they're given the illusion that the South American Indians died. How is that? But we're still here. Do you get what I'm saying? We are still here. We are still here. And they will tell us in other books, well, the Indians died because of smallpox and all this stuff. And that's the reason why I had to point this out for you. Our genetic makeup is similar to our African brothers and sisters. So if the measles and the smallpox did not kill the Africans, they fled into the forest. Why are we to believe that the smallpox killed out all the American Indians? That's a lie. You see, they had to tell us that in order for the doctrine of discovery, the papal bull encomienda, all right, for it to all make sense. You feel me? It had to make sense because it was the only way that they could take possession of the land is to pretend that the people were not there or they all got cleaned out or wiped out or exterminated. All right? You see the logic in that? That's why I say you have to read with overstanding and understanding. The strong cultural similarities between Africa and South America have largely been ignored. But like I tell my YT Kubuli brothers and sisters, aka Dominicans, Africa did not give you the culture we have now. No, we gave it to them. It's ours. The similarities between native South American agriculture and African agriculture have largely been ignored. The similarities between some African cultural practices and some native South American cultural practices have been ignored. The similarities between the native South American architecture and the traditional architecture in some parts of Africa have been ignored. The similarities between native South American names and African names have been ignored. The fact that pyramids exist only in South America, Africa, and the Middle East have been ignored. But that's not true. There are pyramids in South America as well, but they cover them and they call them mounds. Okay? But the majority of the pyramids are in South America and the original ones are in South America. Okay? Even a recent discovery of ancient South American Indian cave paintings depicting Negroes have been ignored from 7,000 years ago. So where did these Negroes come from? They have always been here. The lack of interest in this evidence may be the result of the fact that Westerners are afraid to confront the possibility that there were South American Indians in North Africa at the time that the pyramids were built, because it was our ancestors, due to encroaching invaders, they moved into North Africa and they built those pyramids. I keep telling y'all, man. The objective of this book is to bring the true history of the African continent and the African people to the modern world. This account will narrate in detail the original of the human civilization, the introduction of the civilization to Africa, and the rise of what ancient Egypt and the subsequent rich history of the African people from the ancient Egypt to the ancient empire of Mali. The book is organized in 3 volumes. Volume 1 traces the beginnings of the civilization in South America, the arrival of the South American Indians to Africa, the advent of the ancient Egypt, and the consequent rich history of ancient Egypt. It is also outlines the decline and the collapse of Ancient Egypt and the subsequent southward migration of the ancient Egyptians. Volume 2 outlines the rise of Nubia as the successor to Egypt and amazingly rich history of Nubian empire. So all these empires got their civilization from the original concept of Egypt, which was in the Americas. It also outlines the decline and the collapse of the Nubian Empire, the second southward migration of the ancient Egyptians, the subsequent rise of the great empires of Ghana, okay, and Mali, the interaction between these two empires and South American Indians, and that the rich history of these two empires. So once again, a lot of old people think they came from Ghana and their culture came from Ghana. No, we gave it to Ghana, people. We gave it to Ghana. This volume also outlines the introduction of Islam to Africa and the rise and collapse of Timbuktu, capital of Mali, and the greatest city in all human history. Volume 3 outlines the catastrophic and sudden collapse of the pyramid civilization. All right. Now, like I said, man, y'all could go ahead and read this for yourself. Also, this book speaks of what you call it. I think it's every 26 to 36,000 years, because the earth is tilt on an axis, that the Amazon, it normally switch places with West Africa, and West Africa switch places with the Amazon. So the Amazon switch places. At one point it's in Africa, and at one point it's in the Americas because of the tilt. All right. During certain periods, I think after 20-something or 30-something thousand years. But the point I'm making is we brought civilization to Africa. All right. Now there's a general agreement among, now hear this. There is a general agreement among Western anthropologists that the ancestors of humans evolved in Africa 7 million years ago. Now, my brothers and sisters, what does it say? There is a general agreement. It was a theory that was agreed by westernized anthropologists. Okay? The people who enslave your minds from a Western perspective. As a matter of fact, the Americas is not even in the West. The Americas is really the true East. But because it was the Western hemisphere that colonized the Americas, it was the westernized ideologies that the Americas became West. It wasn't in geography or the location. America is the Far East, the furthest East, the Orient. Okay? But they call it the West because it is only because it was a westernized culture and system, all right, that colonized the Americas, and that's why it became West. A lot of people don't know these things. But like I said here, it's a general agreement. In other words, some people came together and say, hey, let's come up with this theory and say that humans evolved from Africa millions of years ago. Humans evolved in Africa about 3 million years ago. For the first 2 million years, the early humans lived exclusively in African plains. About 1 million years ago, events on the continent forced some humans to leave Africa and travel on tree logs by land to other continents. To understand the nature of the events that forced humans out of Africa, we begin with the climate of the continent. The climate of African continent is the most misunderstood and yet the most talked about climate in the world. We look at Africa today and all we see is the Sahara Desert. And that's what they tell us in America. Oh, well, we came from the sub-Sahara, but sub means under and Sahara means desert. So how could you be from under a desert? But when you look at the map and you look at the equatorial region, you see what's under the Sahara or sub-Sahara is the Americas. So they're telling you the truth. You are American because you came from under sub-Sahara. That's what it means. Under the Sahara. How can you be under the desert? But like I said, man, people don't read with understanding. We look at Africa today and all we see is the sub-Sahara, the Kalahari desert, and the jungles of Central Africa. Because our myopic view of history, we tend to think that the African climate has always been that way it is today. Nothing is further from the truth because of its geographic location. The African continent undergoes severe climate changes, which to the human eyes are very slow or even non-existent, but in reality, they're fast and dynamic. Okay, this establishes fact in astronomy that the planet Earth is tilted on its axis. It is also an established fact that the angle of its tilt is not constant. The angle of the tilt changes slowly, going from one extreme to the other. It takes about 13,000 years to get from one extreme of the tilt to the other. So I apologize. It's not 27,000, it's or 37,000, it's 13,000. Okay, 13,000 years. This slowly changes angle of the tilt has profound effects on the world climate as a whole and the climate of Africa in particular. What we call the Sahara today is actually not the desert. About 7,000 years ago, Sahara was the world's largest and densest forest. So because of the tilt, it alternates, right? Sahara goes from the world's largest forest to the world's largest desert, depending on the angle of the tilt of the Earth on its axis. And it takes approximately 13,000 years to go from one extreme to the other. Okay? The changing climate pattern of the Sahara reflects the changing climate of the African continent as a whole. The African continent as a whole goes from the land that is almost all dense, dark, impenetrable, uninhabitable forest to a land that is almost all dry, barren, uninhabitable deserts. When the forest cycle of Africa starts, it begins in the south and slowly progresses north. At the height of the forest cycle, the African continent is home to the world's largest and densest forest, with more than 90% of the continent covered in forest. When the African continent becomes a forest, it is an incredible dense forest characterized by large trees, enormous rivers, and persistent rainfall all year round. When the desert cycle starts, it begins in the north and slowly progresses south. At the height of the desert cycle, the African continent is home to the world's largest and most barren deserts, with more than half of the continent covered in desert. To support human life, the African continent, as we know it today, is at the height of the desert cycle. All right. So, like I said, you could read this for yourself. I gave you the link. Please read it. But I want to open up your mind to some new information. All right. So we get away from the introduction because that's what we're living in the age of enlightenment. And for those of you who choose to ignore the truth and the facts, I promise you, you are going to be left out. Okay. And you just won't experience the fruits of this enlightenment. You have to renew your mind in order to find the truth. All right. So I gave you the link to the book. Please read, use conductive reasoning. You have to read more information to put the puzzle together, because one book will give you some facts. They will also give you some theories, and sometimes you might read things that just don't make sense, but you have to read other books. I've read damn near close to 2,000 books, prehistoric information. That's why I'm able to piece all this together. All right. So I appreciate y'all for listening, tuning in. Like, subscribe, share the information, hit the notification bell, because we are just getting started. Y'all have an amazing continuation, and we will talk soon. Peace.